The dust of Redemption Gulch settled on a scene of brutal chaos. 4 men lay dead, their blood staining the unforgiving dirt victims of a failed stagecoach robbery. But it was the 5th person a woman pulled from the wreckage who truly haunted Sheriff Clayton Brody. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a terror that went far beyond the morning's violence. He'd saved her from the guns of the outlaws, but as he held her trembling form, a chilling realization dawned upon him. The real danger hadn't been in the bullets that flew, but in the secrets she carried. Secrets that would soon plunge his town into a war he wasn't prepared for, and force him to confront the kind of darkness that even a lawman's badge couldn't hold back. The relentless midday sun beat down on the parched earth of Redemption Gulch, baking the very life out of the landscape. It was a land of harsh beauty, of jagged peaks and sprawling, dusty plains, where only the hardiest of souls dared to carve out an existence. For Sheriff Clayton Brody, it was home. He'd been the law in this corner of the Arizona Territory for 10 years, a man as rugged and unyielding as the land itself. His face weathered by sun and worry was a roadmap of his life, each line a testament to a conflict resolved, a life saved, or a soul lost. The urgent drumming of hoofbeats long before the stagecoach was due was the first sign that something was amiss. Clayton's hand, calloused and sure, instinctively went to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. He stepped out from the cool darkness of his office onto the sun-drenched street. His eyes, the color of faded denim, narrowed against the glare. The stage, when it finally careened into view, was a study in chaos. One of the lead horses was down its leg bent at an unnatural angle, and the driver, a grizzled old-timer named Silas, was slumped over the reins, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Clayton's deputy, a young, eager man named Finn, rushed out from the saloon, his face pale. "Sheriff what in tarnation? Get Doc Adams." Clayton barked, his voice a low growl that carried the weight of authority. "And round up a posse. Looks like the O'Driscoll boys got bold." The O'Driscolls were a plague on the territory, a pack of hyenas who preyed on the weak and the unsuspecting. But they'd never dared to hit a stage so close to town, not in broad daylight. This was different. This was a statement. As Clayton approached the battered stagecoach, a faint whimper from within caught his attention. He motioned for Finn to hold back, his senses on high alert. The door was splintered, hanging precariously from one hinge. Clayton drew his peacemaker, the familiar weight a small comfort in the face of the unknown. With a steady hand, he pulled the door open. The sight that greeted him was one of grim familiarity. 2 male passengers, dressed in the fine clothes of city folk, were dead in their seats, their journey cut short by the O'Driscoll's greed. But it was the woman huddled in the far corner that made his breath catch in his throat. She was a vision of disarray, her traveling dress torn and stained with dust and blood, her fiery red hair the color of a desert sunset, having escaped its intricate braiding to cascade around her shoulders. But it was her eyes that held him captive. They were a maelstrom of terror and defiance, the color of a stormy sky, just before the heavens unleashed their fury. In her arms, she clutched a small leather-bound satchel, holding it to her chest, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Ma'am," Clayton said, his voice softer than he intended. "It's all right. You're safe now. I'm Sheriff Brody." She flinched at the sound of his voice, her eyes darting from his face to the badge pinned to his vest, then back again. He could see the rapid pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. They're gone," she whispered, her voice raspy and laced with a faint accent he couldn't quite place. "They are, ma'am," he assured her, holstering his weapon to show he meant no harm. "But we need to get you out of here." He reached a hand towards her, and for a moment he thought she would recoil. Instead, after a slight hesitation, she placed her small, trembling hand in his. Her skin was cold, despite the suffocating heat. As he helped her down from the stagecoach, a wave of protectiveness washed over him, so fierce and unexpected it nearly staggered him. He'd rescued countless people in his time, but this felt different. It was as if he was holding something fragile and precious, something that had been thrust into his care by a cruel twist of fate. He led her away from the carnage towards the relative sanctuary of his office. The townsfolk had started to gather their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. He shot them a glare that sent them scattering, his unspoken command clear this woman was not a spectacle for their entertainment. Inside his office, the air was cooler heavy with the scent of old paper leather and stale coffee. He guided her to a chair, his hand lingering on her arm for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Can I get you some water, ma'am?" he asked, his voice returning to its usual gruffness in an attempt to regain his professional composure. She nodded, her eyes still wide with shock. He fetched a dipper of water from the bucket in the corner and handed it to her. Her hands were shaking so badly that he had to steady them for her to take a sip. "My name," she said, her voice a little stronger now, "is Loretta Byrne." Loretta, he repeated the name, feeling foreign on his tongue. It was a beautiful name, a name that didn't belong in a place like Redemption Gulch. "Do you have any family, Miss Byrne? Anyone we can contact for you?" She shook her head, her gaze dropping to the satchel she still clutched in her lap. No one." There was a finality in her tone that told him not to press the issue. He knew she was holding something back, a wall of secrets hidden behind those stormy eyes. But for now, it was enough that she was safe. Doc Adams arrived then, a portly man with a kind face and gentle hands. He tended to the small cut on Loretta's forehead, his movements efficient and reassuring. "She's in shock, Clayton," the doctor said, his voice low. "And she's exhausted. She needs rest." Clayton nodded. "She can stay in the spare room upstairs. It's not much, but it's clean and safe." He helped Loretta to her feet, his arm once again circling her waist to support her. As they ascended the narrow staircase to the small apartment above his office, he was acutely aware of her closeness, the faint scent of lavender and dust that clung to her, the warmth of her body against his. When they reached the door to the spare room, he paused. "You'll be safe here, Miss Byrne," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I give you my word." She looked up at him, then her stormy eyes searching his. For the first time since he'd found her, the terror in them seemed to recede, replaced by something else, something he couldn't quite decipher. It looked almost like gratitude. "Thank you, Sheriff," she whispered. He watched her disappear into the room, the click of the lock echoing in the quiet hallway. As he turned to leave, his gaze fell upon the leather satchel she had left on the small table by the door. His lawman's instinct screamed at him to open it, to uncover the secrets she was so desperately trying to protect. But a stronger, more unfamiliar feeling held him back. It was a feeling of trust, a trust he hadn't earned, and she hadn't given, but that had somehow taken root in the space of a few short hours. He descended the stairs, his mind a whirlwind of unanswered questions. Who was Loretta Byrne, and what was in that satchel that had brought the wrath of the O'Driscolls down upon her? He had a sinking feeling that rescuing her from the bandits was only the beginning of his troubles. He had a feeling that he had just invited a storm into his life, a storm that had the power to either cleanse him or destroy him completely. And as he stepped back out into the harsh glare of the Redemption Gulch sun, he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he couldn't let her face it alone. He had rescued a woman from a violent robbery, held her close, and in the process discovered the woman he couldn't lose. The thought was as terrifying as it was exhilarating, and it was a thought that would change the course of his life forever. The days that followed Loretta's arrival in Redemption Gulch were a strange mix of quiet routine and unspoken tension. She remained in the small room above Clayton's office, a ghost in his house, her presence a constant silent question mark. He would hear her pacing at night, the soft creak of the floorboards, a lonely counterpoint to the boisterous sounds of the saloon across the street. During the day, she would sit by the window, her gaze fixed on the dusty expanse beyond the town, as if waiting for something, or someone. Clayton found himself uncharacteristically attentive to her needs. He would leave a tray of food outside her door 3 times a day, a silent offering that was always accepted. He had Finn's wife, a kind, motherly woman named Martha, bring her some fresh clothes, which Loretta accepted with a quiet, almost shy gratitude. But she remained a mystery, a beautiful wounded bird he had taken under his wing, yet knew nothing about. His attempts to gently probe for information were met with a polite but firm wall of silence. She would answer his questions about her health, her comfort. But any inquiry into her past, into the reason she was on that stagecoach, was met with a downcast gaze and a single unyielding response. "I can't talk about it." Clayton, a man used to getting answers, found his patience wearing thin. His lawman's mind was a jumble of theories. Was she a witness to a crime, the runaway wife of a powerful man, or was she herself a criminal, the satchel she guarded so fiercely containing the spoils of some illicit deed? Yet whenever he looked at her, at the vulnerability in her stormy eyes, the last theory seemed impossible. There was a goodness about her, a gentle spirit that belied the secrets she kept. The town, of course, was buzzing with gossip. Loretta Byrne, the mysterious woman the sheriff had taken in, was the subject of endless speculation. The women of the town in their quilting circles and at the general store whispered their theories, their voices, a mixture of pity and suspicion. The men in the smoky haze of the saloon spoke of her beauty, their talk laced with a rough frontier admiration that made Clayton's jaw clench. He found himself defending her honor on more than one occasion, his voice a low growl that dared anyone to speak ill of her. He was her protector, not just from the O'Driscolls, but from the prying eyes and wagging tongues of Redemption Gulch. One evening, about a week after her arrival, Clayton sat at his desk, staring at the growing pile of paperwork, his mind anywhere but on his duties. The scent of rain was in the air, a rare and welcome promise of relief from the relentless heat. He heard the faint creak of the stairs and looked up to see Loretta standing in the doorway of his office. She was wearing one of the simple cotton dresses Martha had brought her, the pale blue color making her fiery hair seem even more vibrant. "Sheriff," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Miss Byrne," he replied, rising to his feet. "Is everything all right?" She nodded, but her hands were twisting the fabric of her dress, a sure sign of her nervousness. I wanted to thank you," she said, her gaze fixed on the floor. "For everything. For your kindness." "It's my job to help people, ma'am," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. She finally looked up at him, and her eyes, for the first time, were not filled with terror or sadness, but with a quiet sincerity. "No," she said, "it's more than that. You've been a gentleman." The word felt strange in the context of his life, a life of gunfights and hard justice. He wasn't a gentleman. He was a lawman, a man who did what needed to be done. But coming from her, the word was a balm to his weary soul. I baked you something," she said, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. She held out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. "It's not much, just a small apple cake. I found the ingredients in the pantry upstairs." He took the offering, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. The warmth of her skin sent a jolt through him, a jolt that had nothing to do with the still-warm cake. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a perfectly baked little cake, the sweet scent of cinnamon and apples filling the air. "Thank you, Miss Byrne," he said, his voice softer now. This is very thoughtful." "It's Loretta," she corrected him gently. "Please." "Loretta," he repeated, and this time the name felt as familiar as his own. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. Would you care to join me? The coffee's fresh." To his surprise, she agreed. He poured them both a cup of the strong black coffee he favored, and they sat in the quiet of his office, the world outside seeming to fade away. For the first time they talked, not about her past, not about the O'Driscolls, but about simple things. She asked him about his life as a sheriff, about the town, about the people he protected. He, in turn, found himself telling her stories he hadn't shared with anyone. Stories of his childhood in the east, of his decision to come west, in search of a new life, of the joys and sorrows of his chosen profession. He learned that she had a quick wit and a gentle laugh, a laugh that was like music to his ears. He saw a strength in her, a resilience that was as captivating as her beauty. And as they talked, as the storm outside finally broke, washing the dust from the streets and the tension from the air, he felt a connection to her, a bond that went beyond that of a lawman and a woman he had rescued. It was in that moment, in the warm glow of the lamplight with the rain drumming a steady rhythm on the roof, that he knew he was in trouble. The wall he had so carefully built around his heart, a wall designed to protect him from the pain and loss that were so much a part of his world, was beginning to crumble. And the woman sitting across from him, the woman with the stormy eyes and the secret past, was the one who was bringing it down brick by brick. The evening ended with a shared slice of apple cake, a simple act of communion that felt more intimate than any he had ever known. When Loretta finally bid him good night and retreated to her room, the scent of her, of lavender and cinnamon, lingered in the air, a sweet torment to his senses. He sat alone in the darkness, the half-eaten cake on his desk, a testament to the evening's unexpected turn. He had offered her sanctuary, a safe haven from the dangers that pursued her. But as he listened to the rain and the silence of the house, he realized that he was the one who was no longer safe. He had let her in, not just into his home, but into his life, and in doing so, he had opened himself up to a world of emotions he had long since buried. His thoughts turned to the satchel still sitting untouched in her room. The need to know its contents, to understand the danger she was in, was a gnawing hunger in his gut. But it was no longer just a lawman's curiosity. It was the desperate need of a man who was falling for a woman he barely knew, a woman whose secrets could very well get them both killed. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, staring out at the rain-slicked street. The town of Redemption Gulch was quiet asleep under the blanket of the storm. But for Clayton Brody, sleep was a distant prospect. His world had been turned upside down by a woman with fire in her hair and secrets in her eyes. He had rescued her from the bandits, but who, he wondered, was going to rescue him from her? He had a feeling the answer was no one, and as he stood there watching the lightning flash across the dark sky, he knew with a terrifying certainty that he was already lost. The fragile peace that had settled between Clayton and Loretta was shattered 3 days later by the arrival of a stranger in Redemption Gulch. He rode in on a magnificent black stallion, a stark contrast to the dusty, work-worn horses of the local folk. He was dressed in a tailored black suit, his face clean-shaven, his dark hair slicked back with a precision that was utterly out of place in the rough-and-tumble town. He carried himself with an air of quiet authority, his cold, calculating eyes scanning the street as if he owned it. Clayton watched him from the window of his office, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He'd seen men like this before, men who oozed a dangerous combination of wealth and ruthlessness. They were usually harbingers of trouble, their arrival signaling a shift in the delicate balance of power in the territory. The stranger dismounted in front of the saloon, his movements fluid and economical. He didn't tether his horse to the hitching post. Instead, he simply dropped the reins, a silent command that the magnificent animal understood. He then strode into the saloon, the batwing doors swinging shut behind him, leaving a palpable sense of unease in his wake. Clayton's instincts, honed by years of dealing with the underbelly of the West, were screaming at him. This man's arrival was no coincidence. He was here for a reason, and Clayton had a sinking feeling that reason was currently residing in the room above his head. He found Loretta by her window, her face ashen, her body rigid with a fear that was far more profound than anything he had seen in her before. She was staring at the black stallion, her knuckles white, as she gripped the windowsill. "Loretta," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Do you know that man?" She didn't answer at first, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. When she finally spoke, her voice was a hoarse whisper laced with a terror that chilled him to the bone. "His name is Caspian Thorne." The name meant nothing to Clayton, but the way she said it, the sheer terror it evoked, told him everything he needed to know. This was the man she was running from. This was the source of her secrets, the reason for her flight. He's my husband." The words hit Clayton with the force of a physical blow. Husband. The word was a poisoned dart piercing the fragile bubble of hope that had begun to form around his heart. He had allowed himself to dream, to imagine a future with this woman, a future that had just been obliterated by a single, devastating word. He struggled to keep his voice even, to mask the maelstrom of emotions that was churning within him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice rough with a pain he couldn't hide. Her stormy eyes, now filled with tears, finally met his. "I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid you wouldn't help me if you knew. Afraid you would send me back to him." "Send you back to him," he repeated, a cold anger beginning to replace the pain. "Loretta, what has this man done to you?" She flinched, her gaze dropping to her hands. When she looked up again, her eyes were filled with a mixture of shame and defiance. "Caspian is not a man you say no to, Sheriff," she said, her voice trembling. He's a collector of beautiful things, and he considers me his most prized possession." She went on to tell him a story that made his blood run cold. A story of a life of gilded misery, of a marriage that was a prison, of a husband whose love was a suffocating obsession. Caspian Thorne, she explained, was a wealthy and powerful man from back east, a man who dealt in secrets and influence, a man whose reach was as long as his memory. She was the daughter of a business associate. He had ruined a payment for her father's debts. She had been forced into the marriage, her life becoming a carefully orchestrated performance for the benefit of her husband's vanity. The satchel, she confessed, contained the evidence of his crimes ledgers detailing his illegal business dealings, letters implicating him in political corruption, proof of a life built on the ruins of others. It was her only leverage, her only hope of ever being free. The O'Driscolls, Clayton surmised, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. He hired them to get the satchel back. She nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "He would have killed me to get it back. To him, my life is a small price to pay for protecting his empire." Clayton's hand went to his gun, the cold steel of familiar comfort, in the face of this new, more insidious threat. The O'Driscolls were simple, violent men. Caspian Thorne was something else entirely. He was a snake, a creature of a different, more venomous breed. "He won't lay a hand on you, Loretta," Clayton vowed, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Not while I'm alive." He meant it. Every word. The revelation of her marriage had been a blow, but it had also solidified his resolve. She was not just a woman he was falling for. She was a woman in desperate need of a champion, a defender, and he would be that man. He instructed her to stay in her room, to keep the door locked, and to not make a sound. He then descended the stairs, his face a grim mask of determination. The time for quiet observation was over. It was time to confront the devil at his doorstep. He found Caspian Thorne at a table in the corner of the saloon, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The man exuded an aura of calm, predatory power. He looked up as Clayton approached, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his lips. "Sheriff Brody," He said, his voice as smooth as silk and just as cold. "I was wondering when you'd grace me with your presence." "Thorn," Clayton said, his voice flat and devoid of any pleasantry, "you're not welcome in my town." Caspian chuckled a low, condescending sound. "Your town, a charming sentiment, Sheriff, but I'm not here for a social call. I'm here for my property." Clayton's hand twitched, his fingers itching to draw his weapon. "If you're referring to Miss Byrne," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "she's not property, and she's not going anywhere with you." Caspian's eyes narrowed, the mask of civility slipping to reveal the cold, hard ruthlessness beneath. "I see," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "She's filled your head with her little stories, has she? The damsel in distress, the cruel, villainous husband. It's a role she plays quite well." He took a sip of his whiskey, his gaze never leaving Clayton's. "But let me tell you the real story, Sheriff. My wife is a thief. She stole something from me, something of great value. I'm simply here to retrieve what is mine." "The only thing of value she has is her life," Clayton countered, "and you seem intent on taking that from her." Caspian's smile returned, but this time it was all naïve. "You're a sentimental man, Sheriff, a dangerous trait in your line of work. You've allowed a pretty face to cloud your judgment, but I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to overlook your indiscretion. Return my wife and the satchel and I'll be on my way. No one else needs to get hurt." It was a threat cloaked in the language of reason, a threat that extended not just to Clayton, but to the entire town. Caspian Thorne had the resources to bring a war to Redemption Gulch, a war that Clayton and his small posse of deputies would have no hope of winning. But Clayton Brody was not a man who backed down from a fight, especially not when the stakes were this high. He looked the man in the eye, his own gaze as unyielding as the mountains that surrounded them. "That's not going to happen," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Loretta Byrne is under my protection, and as for you, I want you out of my town by sunrise." Caspian's eyes flashed with a fury that was truly terrifying to behold. He stood up his chair, scraping against the wooden floor. The saloon, which had been buzzing with conversation, fell silent, the patron sensing the imminent explosion. "You've just made a very powerful enemy, Sheriff." Caspian hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "And you have no idea who you're dealing with, Thorne," Clayton shot back. "This is my town, my law, and you are not welcome here." For a long moment, the two men stood facing each other, a silent battle of wills in the middle of the crowded saloon. Then, with a final contemptuous sneer, Caspian turned and strode out of the saloon, the doors swinging wildly in his wake. Clayton watched him go, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just drawn a line in the sand, a line that Caspian Thorne would undoubtedly try to cross. The fight for Redemption Gulch and for Loretta Byrne had just begun, and as he stood there, the weight of his decision settling upon him, he knew that the storm he had invited into his life was about to break, and the flood that followed would spare no one. He had rescued a woman from bandits only to find himself facing a far more dangerous foe. He had held her close only to discover she belonged to another. And in that moment, he knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating that he would risk everything, his town, his life, his very soul, to keep her safe. He had discovered the woman he couldn't lose, and he would be damned if he was going to let her go. The sunrise that Caspian Thorne was supposed to be gone by came and went, and with it any hope of a peaceful resolution. Thorne, it seemed, was a man of his word, but only when it suited him. He had not left Redemption Gulch. Instead, he had taken up residence in the town's only hotel, a constant menacing presence that cast a long shadow over the dusty streets. He didn't make a direct move against Clayton or Loretta. He was too clever for that. Instead, he began a slow, insidious campaign to turn the town against its sheriff. He was a man of immense wealth, and he used it to his advantage. He bought rounds of drinks for everyone in the saloon, his voice a smooth, persuasive whisper as he spun his tale of the wronged husband, the thieving wife, and the misguided sheriff who was protecting her. He paid off the O'Driscolls not to leave the territory, but to stay to lurk on the outskirts of town, a constant visible threat that reminded the townsfolk of the danger Clayton had brought upon them. The ranchers who had to drive their cattle through O'Driscoll territory began to grumble. The merchants whose supply wagons were now at risk started to look at Clayton with accusing eyes. Fear, like a slow-acting poison, began to seep into the heart of Redemption Gulch. Clayton found himself isolated, a lone bastion of defiance in a town that was slowly turning against him. Even his own deputy Finn began to show signs of doubt. "Sheriff," he said one morning, his young face etched with worry. "The folks are getting scared. They're saying you're putting the whole town at risk for her." "She has a name, Finn," Clayton said, his voice sharp. "And she's a victim in all this, not the cause of it." "But is she?" Finn pressed his voice, barely a whisper. "Thorne, he's a persuasive man. He's got folks believing she's a common thief." Clayton's fist clenched on his desk. He knew Finn was just echoing the sentiments of the town, but it still felt like a betrayal. "I know what I'm doing, Finn," he said, his voice low and firm. "You either trust me or you don't." Finn had the grace to look ashamed. "I trust you, Sheriff. It's a heavy burden you're carrying." "It's my burden to carry," Clayton said, ending the conversation. But Finn's words had hit their mark. The weight of his decision was becoming almost unbearable. He was not just fighting Caspian Thorne. He was fighting the fear and doubt of the very people he had sworn to protect. Loretta, confined to the small apartment above his office, was not immune to the town's growing hostility. She saw the suspicious glances, heard the whispered condemnations. The guilt, she felt, was a palpable thing, a heavy shroud that seemed to smother her. "This is my fault," she said to Clayton one evening, her voice choked with tears. "I've brought this trouble to your door, to your town. Maybe I should just go. Give him what he wants." Clayton took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. "Don't you ever say that," he said, his voice fierce. "You are not to blame for his wickedness, and you are not a pawn to be sacrificed for the sake of a false peace." He looked into her stormy eyes, and in their depths he saw not just fear, but a flicker of the same defiance he had seen on the day he rescued her. It was a small flame, but it was enough to rekindle his own resolve. "We're going to fight him, Loretta," he said, his voice a low, steady promise. "We're going to expose him for what he is." His words seemed to give her strength. She straightened her shoulders, her chin held a little higher. "How?" she asked. "He has everyone convinced I'm the villain." "He's a man of secrets," Clayton said, his mind already working, formulating a plan. "And secrets have a way of coming to light, especially in a small town." His plan was simple, but dangerous. He needed to get his hands on the ledgers in Loretta's satchel, to find something in them that would be undeniable proof of Thorne's villainy, something that would turn the tide of public opinion back in their favor. But to do that, he needed to get the satchel out of his office, away from the prying eyes of Thorne's spies, who he was sure were watching his every move. He decided to use the cover of darkness, a plan that was fraught with risk. He would take the satchel to Doc Adams's office, a place of trust and neutrality in the town. The doctor, a man of science and reason, was one of the few people who had not yet been swayed by Thorne's silver tongue. That night, under the cloak of a moonless sky, Clayton put his plan into action. He wrapped the satchel in a rough burlap sack, hoping to disguise its shape. He gave Loretta his spare peacemaker, showing her how to use it, his hands covering hers in a way that was both practical and intimate. "Just in case," he said, his voice a low whisper. "Don't be afraid to use it." She nodded, her eyes wide but determined. "Be careful, Clayton," she whispered, her use of his first name, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them. He slipped out the back door of his office, sticking to the shadows, his senses on high alert. The town was quiet, but it was a tense, watchful quiet. He could feel the eyes on him, the unseen observers in the darkness. He made it to the main street, his heart pounding in his chest. Doc Adams's office was just across the way, a beacon of light in the darkness. He took a deep breath and was about to make a run for it when a voice from the shadows stopped him dead in his tracks. "Going somewhere, Sheriff?" It was Thorne. He stepped out from the darkness of an alleyway, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. He was not alone. Flanking him were two of the O'Driscoll brothers, their guns drawn, and aimed at Clayton's chest. Clayton's hand went to his own weapon, but he knew he was outmatched. Any sudden move, and he would be dead. "I knew you couldn't resist the temptation of that little satchel," Thorne said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're a predictable man, Sheriff. Honorable, but predictable." He gestured to the burlap sack in Clayton's hand. "Give it to me," he commanded. Clayton's mind raced. He was trapped. To give up the satchel was to give up Loretta, to condemn her to a life of misery. To refuse was to sign his own death warrant. He chose defiance. "You'll have to kill me for it," he said, his voice a low growl. Thorne chuckled. "That can be arranged," he said. "But I'd rather not. It would be messy, and I'm a man who prefers things to be neat and tidy." He took a step closer, his eyes gleaming with a cold, cruel light. "I'll give you one last chance, Sheriff. The satchel for your life. A fair trade, I think." It was in that moment, in the face of certain death, that Clayton's life flashed before his eyes. He saw his years as a lawman, the faces of the people he had protected, the ghosts of the men he had been forced to kill. And he saw Loretta's face, her stormy eyes, her fiery hair, the woman who had brought a storm into his life and made him feel more alive than he had ever felt before. He had rescued her from bandits, he had held her close, and he had discovered the woman he couldn't lose. He would not lose her now. With a roar of defiance, he threw the satchel not at Thorne, but into the middle of the street. It was a desperate, reckless move designed to create a diversion, to give himself a fighting chance. As Thorne and the O'Driscolls instinctively turned their attention to the satchel, Clayton drew his peacemaker. The world seemed to slow down, the silence of the night, shattered by the deafening roar of gunfire. He shot one of the O'Driscoll brothers, the man dropping to the ground with a cry of pain. He dove for cover behind a water trough, the wood splintering as the other O'Driscoll's bullet slammed into it. Thorne, his face a mask of fury, retrieved the satchel. "You fool!" he screamed. "You've just sealed your own fate!" He turned to run, to escape with his prize, but a second gunshot, this one from a different direction, stopped him in his tracks. A look of stunned surprise crossed his face, and he crumpled to the ground, the satchel falling from his grasp. Clayton looked up to see Loretta standing in the doorway of his office, the spare peacemaker in her hands, smoke curling from its barrel. Her face was pale, but her hand was steady, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire. She had saved him. The woman he had sworn to protect had become his protector. The remaining O'Driscoll, seeing his employer and his brother down, lost his nerve. He fired one last wild shot in their direction before disappearing into the darkness. The street fell silent once more, the only sound the ragged breathing of Clayton and Loretta, the smell of gunpowder heavy in the air. Clayton rose from his cover, his gun still in his hand, and walked towards Loretta. She was shaking, the adrenaline of the moment beginning to fade, replaced by the shock of what she had done. He reached her and gently took the gun from her trembling hands. He then pulled her into his arms, holding her close, his heart overflowing with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a love so fierce it stole his breath away. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "It's finally over." She clung to him, her body trembling against his. I thought he was going to kill you," she sobbed. "He almost did," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life, Loretta." He held her at arm's length, his hands framing her face. He looked into her stormy eyes, and for the first time he saw not fear, not secrets, not defiance, but a reflection of the same love that was consuming him. He lowered his head and kissed her, then a kiss that was both a culmination and a beginning. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that promised a future, a kiss that said everything his words could not. In the middle of the dusty street of Redemption Gulch, under the vast, star-strewn sky, a sheriff who had rescued a woman from bandits who had held her close had not only discovered the woman he couldn't lose, but had been saved by her in return. The storm she had brought into his life had passed, and in its wake, it had washed away the loneliness and the sorrow, leaving behind a love that was as strong and as enduring as the land itself. The real drama of their lives was just beginning, but for the first time, they would face it together. The death of Caspian Thorne on the main street of Redemption Gulch was an event that sent shock waves through the small town. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of activity. Doc Adams, roused by the gunfire, rushed out to pronounce Thorne and the wounded O'Driscoll dead. Finn, his face a mixture of shock and awe, rounded up a posse to hunt down the fleeing O'Driscoll brother, a task they accomplished by dawn. But as the sun rose, casting its golden light on the scene of the previous night's violence, a new reality began to set in. Clayton Brody, the town's stoic and unshakable sheriff, had not only defied a powerful and dangerous man, but had been saved by the very woman he was protecting. And Loretta Byrne, the mysterious and beautiful stranger, was not a thieving wife, but a woman of courage and conviction, a woman who had stood her ground against a tyrant and won. The satchel, the object of so much strife and bloodshed, was finally opened. In the quiet of Clayton's office, with the morning sun streaming through the window, they laid out its contents on his desk. The ledgers and letters were a damning indictment of Caspian Thorne's life, a detailed account of a criminal empire built on bribery, extortion, and intimidation. The townsfolk who had been so quick to condemn Loretta were now faced with the undeniable truth of her story. The whispers of suspicion were replaced by murmurs of admiration. The women who had once pitied her now looked at her with a newfound respect. The men in the saloon who had been swayed by Thorne's whiskey and lies now raised their glasses to the brave woman who had stood by their sheriff. Redemption Gulch, a town that had been on the brink of turning against its protector, had been given a harsh but necessary lesson in loyalty and judgment. They had been reminded that true character is not revealed in whispered rumors and easy accusations, but in actions in courage, in the willingness to stand up for what is right, no matter the cost. For Clayton and Loretta, the end of the siege was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The walls between them, built of secrets and suspicion, had been torn down, replaced by a bond forged in shared danger and mutual respect. The love that had been a fragile, unspoken thing was now a powerful and undeniable force, a steady flame that warmed the corners of their once lonely hearts. They were a study in contrasts, the rugged, world-weary lawman and the refined, resilient woman from a world he had only ever read about. But in their differences, they found a strange and beautiful harmony. He taught her about the simple, profound beauty of the western landscape, the language of the wind, the wisdom of the stars. She in turn brought a softness and a warmth to his life, a gentle grace that soothed the rough edges of his soul. The apartment above his office, once a place of confinement for her, became their shared sanctuary, a home filled with the scent of her baking and the sound of her laughter. The spare room where she had once hidden from the world became their bedroom, a place of shared dreams and whispered confessions. But their newfound happiness was not without its challenges. The world outside Redemption Gulch did not simply forget a man like Caspian Thorne. His death left a power vacuum, and the tendrils of his corrupt empire extended far beyond the dusty streets of their small town. There were inquiries from federal marshals, questions from powerful men in the East, whose names were mentioned in Thorne's ledgers, and the ever-present threat of retaliation from those who had benefited from his crimes. Clayton, with Loretta by his side, faced these challenges with the same quiet determination he had shown in his fight against Thorne. The ledgers, once a source of danger, became their greatest weapon. They provided the evidence needed to dismantle Thorne's network, to bring his co-conspirators to justice, and to finally truly set Loretta free. It was a long and arduous process, a battle fought not with guns, but with telegrams, depositions, and the slow, grinding wheels of justice. But through it all, they stood together, their love, a constant source of strength. Loretta, no longer a damsel in distress, became an active partner in her own liberation. Her knowledge of Thorne's affairs proved invaluable, her testimony a powerful indictment of the man who had tried to crush her spirit. As the months turned into a year, the shadow of Caspian Thorne finally began to recede. The inquiries from the East became less frequent. The threat of retaliation faded, and the world began to forget the scandal that had rocked Redemption Gulch. The town, in turn, settled back into its familiar rhythm, its people forever changed by the events they had witnessed. One crisp autumn afternoon, Clayton and Loretta stood on a small hill overlooking the town. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, the same colors as Loretta's fiery hair. A gentle breeze rustled the dry leaves, carrying with it the scent of pine and wood smoke. "It's beautiful," Loretta said, her head resting on Clayton's shoulder. "It is." He agreed, his arm tightening around her. They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching as the lights of the town began to flicker on one by one. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "The life you had before, the cities, the fine clothes, the parties." She turned to look at him, her stormy eyes soft in the fading light. "That wasn't a life, Clayton," she said. "It was a cage, a beautiful, gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless." She reached up and touched his weathered cheek, her fingers tracing the lines that life had etched there. "This is life," she said, her voice filled with a quiet conviction. "Being with you in this place, this is freedom." He looked at the town below, his town, the place he had fought for, the place that had become their home. "I never thought I'd find happiness here," he confessed. "I came here to escape my past, to build a new life, but I never imagined that life would include you." "And I never imagined a life beyond the one I was trapped in," she said. "You didn't just rescue me from bandits, Clayton. You rescued me from a life without hope, without love." He turned to face her, his hands cupping her face. "I held you close that day," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I knew in that moment that I couldn't lose you. I didn't know why then. I just knew it in my soul. And I knew," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears, "that I had finally found a man who saw me not as a possession, but as a person, a man who was willing to risk everything for me." He lowered his head and kissed her a slow, tender kiss that was a testament to the love that had grown between them, a love that had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger, more resilient, more beautiful. The story of the sheriff and the woman he rescued became a legend in Redemption Gulch, a tale told and retold around campfires and in the smoky haze of the saloon. It was a story of courage, of love, of the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of threats. But for Clayton Brody and Loretta Byrne, it was not a legend. It was their life, a life they had built together, a life of quiet joy and shared purpose, a life that was a testament to the fact that sometimes in the most unlikely of places, in the most unexpected of circumstances, you can find the one person you were always meant to be with. The sheriff who had rescued a woman from bandits who had held her close had not only discovered the woman he couldn't lose, but had found in her the love of a lifetime. And in the heart of the wild, untamed West, they had found their own personal redemption. The tale of Sheriff Clayton Brody and Loretta Byrne is more than just a story of the Wild West. It's a testament to the enduring power of courage, the unwavering strength of love, and the profound truth that even in the darkest of times, a single act of bravery can change everything. Their journey from a brutal stagecoach robbery to a life shared in the quiet corners of Redemption Gulch reminds us that our past does not have to define our future, and that the greatest treasures are not found in gold or riches, but in the heart of another. If their story of love loss and redemption resonated with you, if you found yourself rooting for the stoic sheriff and the fiery woman who stole his heart, then please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed the journey. Share this video with fellow lovers of epic storytelling, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales from the heart of the American West. Your support allows us to continue bringing these stories to life. Thank you for listening.